Hey, good morning. Pete, North Las Vegas. Today's video is a side-by-side of an original Colt A2 Sporter HBAR and a clone that I just recently built of that Colt HBAR. Some of you that know your Colts probably have already identified the imposter. But anyway, we'll go over the clone and some of the differences and things I had to compromise on, and some of the what I think are improvements that I made on the clone to the old original Colt. And then maybe the last part of the video, we're going to talk about the Harrington and Richardson A2 handguard that I just recently got. And I have that installed on this rifle right now, but I'll pop one of the halves off and we'll take a look at it. Okay, so what we're looking at right now is the Colt. And back then they used peel washers. And from a distance, it just looks like a couple of washers that they stacked. But if you get very close, I'm going to try to get a good shot here. You can see the individual peels. And what you did back then was you heated that with a match or lighter. And that would kind of separate the peels. So you could maybe get a razor blade in there and start separating the stacked peel washer, and get your A2 flash hider indexed properly on the barrel. And then what I did here on the Imposter was I just used 3 or 4 Surefire shims that you normally use for like mounting a suppressor or can. Make sure that you've got it on straight. Okay, so we're looking at the Colt again, and you can see on the inside of the bird cage, the machining's a little rough. You can see all the markings in there. And if we look at the Fulton Armory, the one I got from Fulton Armory, you can see the machining is quite a bit smoother on the inside. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with the Colt Sporter, 20-inch manganese phosphate chrome lined. And this barrel uses a rifle cut extension. And while I was trying to put together this clone, I could not find a similar barrel. So I ended up having to settle for a Criterion. And this is also an HBAR. And it uses the M4 cut barrel extensions. And visibly, there's a little bit of a difference besides the barrel markings. You can see the distance here where Colt machined up to the shoulder is quite a bit longer than the Criterion. So appearance-wise, other than the barrel markings, there's a difference. Okay, so we're looking at the Colt again, and you'll notice that the arrow and the up are different than the markings on the Fulton Armory. The Fulton Armory kind of has an enclosed direction arrow. I kind of like the Colt better. It just seems a little cleaner to me for some reason. Okay, so we're looking at the Colt again. And at the beginning of the video, I said, you know, you guys that really know your Colts probably noticed that the Sporter does not have a bayonet lug. And the other thing that you might have been able to pick up on from a distance is that the sling swivel is not coated. And here's the Fulton Armory with the bayonet lug. And you can see the coating on the sling swivel. I'm sure the non-coated are still available, or you could just maybe buy one of these and peel the coating off if you wanted to be a little bit more clone correct. There's the casting mark on the Colt, and it looks like the overall casting finish is a little bit smoother on the Colt than the Fulton Armory. The Fulton Armory seems to have a much rougher appearance. Different casting. Okay, so these are standard A2 front sight bases, so there's no F mark. Okay, so what we're looking at right now is the Harrington and Richardson A2 handguard, and I think they're pretty good. And here's the piece I just popped off. You can see all the vent holes are drilled nice and clean. Everything lines up. A little bit shinier than the Colt, but overall not bad at all. They've glued the tabs in. It does have the do not remove stamping, just like the Colt. And overall, this is a quality piece. When I put it on the rifle, it's very snug, it's tight, it doesn't bend, twist, or do anything. So I think this is a true GI spec. As far as I can tell, in the areas where they did a little trimming, it looks to me like it's the correct polymer resin fiberglass mix. Some of the really cheaper handguards they're just all plastic and they're junk. Speaking of junk, in the last video, I also compared a Fulton Armory. Do not buy a Fulton Armory A2 handguard. They are just crap. I think that's worth repeating. Do not buy the Fulton Armory A2 round handguard, at least as of today. Now, maybe at some future date, they'll start stocking something that's more quality. But anyway, there's the part number and what we got here. And as far as the heat shielding goes on the Harrington and Richardson, they did that all correct also. The tabs here overlap like they're supposed to. On the Fulton Armory that I reviewed in the last video, there's a big, huge gap here because there were no tabs on the sides. Here's an old Wyndham weaponry. You can see how the heat shield is supposed to overlap inside. So those of you that are not familiar with heavy barrel profiles, compared to other profiles, government, pencil, different manufacturers do different things, but that's a beefy burrito in there. Okay, so we're looking at the Colt again, and you can see the vent holes are very clean. There's no leftovers, just very smooth. The coloration of the back part of the heat shield is a little different, almost has like a greenish gray color. That could be because of age and just, you know, use, getting heated up and cooled off a few times. Whereas the Harrington and Richardson has more of a gray appearance. The holes are pretty good. They're not bad, but you can see they're not quite as clean as the Colt. And the Wyndham weaponry is the same way. As I would say, they're just as clean as the Colt. So the vent holes, I would have to say Colt's the best. This old Wyndham's pretty good. And these aren't quite as good, but they're not bad. And I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but if you haven't seen the last video where I took a close look at the Fulton Armories, the vent hole areas were not as good. Okay, so one last external shot on the Colt. You can see very good fitment, virtually no gap. And Harrington and Richardson is pretty good. And as I was saying earlier, when we first started talking about the handguards, the Harrington and Richardson fitment around the barrel net, there's just about no movement at all between the handguard and the barrel net. So it's a very snug, tight fit. And just like the Colt. So if you're looking for a decent set of A2s, Harrington and Richardson, might take a look at them. They're not cheap. I spent $64 on this set. Okay, so on the Colt fixed carry handle, you can see where they smooth this out pretty good. A little bit of a line there where they didn't quite get the transition perfect, but the front looks pretty good. And Harrington and Richardson left the flashing. Now, it's not completely rough on the outside. Looks like they buffed or smoothed it out a little bit, but they left that there. And that's intentional. They decided to carry the flashing over from the A1 to the A2. So if you order from Harrington Richardson, this is not a blem. This is how it's going to show up. So you might want to be aware of that. And then the flashing on the inside of the H&R is a little bit rougher. And the flashing is still there on the Colt, but once again, it looks like they smoothed it out a little bit. There's a little bit of a mismatch here between the upper and lower. I don't know, what's causing that, whether it's the upper or the lower. The fitment on the Harrington Richardson's a little bit better, much closer. Okay, so this is the Fulton Armory rear sight assembly. And you'll notice that the markings are different. Here, you'll notice the arrows and the lettering are stamped a little different between this Fulton Armory and the Colt. Now, I think the Colt looks cleaner. And like I said, you'll notice a difference between the arrows, where on the Colt, the arrows are completely recessed. And then on the Fulton Armory, they're kind of outlined. So anyway, we'll have to give the rear sight to the Colt. Okay, so on the old Colt, nice and smooth back here. And if we compare that to the Harrington and Richardson, once again, they left the flashing behind just like they did on the front. Like I said, it's not real rough on the outside of the carry handle. So they did smooth it out a little bit, but you can still see that it's there. If you look at the Colt charging handle, you'll see that it's machined a little rough. Let me get the right angle. You can see that the Colt original charging handles not quite as nice as the Fulton Armory. So the Fulton Armory is machined quite a bit smoother. And then once again, the markings on the elevation drum and the windage are different. This is the Colt here. And I think the Colt, as far as cosmetics, it looks better than the Fulton Armory. Okay, so on the Colt, you can see the machined area here, on the bottom of the upper receiver. Pretty uneven. Colt used a nice bright stainless spring. And this is Harrington and Richardson. Much more uniform machining in this area. And I don't know if the camera's doing this justice, but this is nowhere near as bright as the Colt spring. But you can tell it's stainless too. Okay, this is the Colt forward assist button here. And I used Aero Precision on this clone build. And I don't know, I'm gonna have to give it to Colt. To me anyway, the Colt looks better. Maybe you guys like the Aero Precision better. Okay, so before we get into the internals of the upper, I also wanted to mention that the Colt has little or no slop. On some of these carry handles, these move quite a bit, and this has virtually no movement at all on the Colt. And the same thing with the Fulton Armory on top of the Harrington and Richardson. Very, very little slop. I mean, I can barely move this rear sight from side to side. So both the Fulton Armory, Harrington Richardson, and the original Colt, the rear sights are very nice, tight, snug fits. Okay, so before we get back onto the upper, I have to go down to the lower for just a few seconds here. My old Colt is what's called a sear block lower. And you can see how this is blind pinned into the lower receiver. And these blind pins on both sides and a roll pin down here, so they have this thing pinned in 3 different ways. And that was to prevent somebody from putting in a drop-in auto sear or full auto parts, or at least try to slow you down. And because of that sear block, the Colt upper has to use this special type of bolt carrier. You can see where the bottom half of the bolt carrier has been removed to get clearance around the sear block. And on my clone build, we used a full-size M16 bolt carrier because there is no sear block. Okay, so this is the lower sear block Colt bolt carrier. And back then they marked them with a C. And once again, here's the back of the bolt carrier that's been shaved down. And also, you can see that on this Wilson Combat non-logo that the firing pin is fully shrouded, whereas on the Colt, the firing pin is exposed. So this non-logoed Wilson Combat is very much like a true M16 spec bolt carrier. And I've often wondered, I don't know, I often wondered if because they shaved so much of this bolt off on the bottom on the Colt, if they maybe lightened up the buffer also. I'm thinking they probably didn't, but that thought had crossed my mind. Okay, so for some of you that maybe aren't as familiar with the AR platform, this is what's called a rifle cut barrel extension that I was talking about earlier. And you can see right in here, there's no cuts onto the upper receiver itself. You can see that the barrel extension cuts end a little further up. And now we'll take a look at an M4 cut barrel extension on the clone build. Okay, so on the M4 cut receiver, you can see where they actually machined into the receiver and how the cuts on the barrel extension are quite a bit different. We'll go back over here and look at this one. As soon as Okay, so we'll take a look at the externals on both lowers and see if anything jumps out at us. And this H&R version is what they call the COTS, and that's commercial off the shelf. And I talked about that in the last video, but the main difference between this lower and the M16 is the other version of the H&R will say property of U.S. government, and there's no space between the M16 and the A2. It's just all continuous. And then on the M16 version that the H&R sells, this will be marked burst, not auto, so that's the main difference. And in the other video, I did explain a little bit about the COTS program and how that worked for the military contracting. So I'm not going to hit that again, but just want to let you know that this is the COTS version lower. Okay, so this is the Colt. And this is the H&R. You can see where they left some of the flashing behind. You can see the cut up here is a little bit different. It's kind of more radiused, where the Colt is more angular. Okay, so we'll take a look at the back end of the left side here. You'll see that on the Colt, these differences here and the selector switch is going to be different on the clone build in Harrington and Richardson. Now this if I remember right, came from Fulton Armory. So you can see where the selector lever portion here goes all the way up inside the flat area. And Harrington and Richardson left these stops in place. And this area here is machined a little bit different. So now we'll go back to the Colt, and you can see that this is smoother. Machine that down. And this is a Colt original part here where this lever doesn't go all the way up as high as the Fulton Armory. Okay, the pistol grip, if you look at the profile on this bump out here for the A2, you'll see that it's a little sharper profile. The checkering is a little bit less aggressive. I didn't see much difference on the back end here. So you can see that this isn't quite as pointy. Checkering is a little bit more aggressive. And the back ribbing looks about the same. And you can see that on the molding here that there's this kind of a ridge or whatever you want to call that. Whereas the Colt is perfectly flat. Okay, so on the Colt you can see where it's been stamped. It's deeper, not quite as uniform. And you can tell on the Harrington and Richardson it's been laser cut. Although they did cut it pretty deep. I've seen some laser cuts, like on my Wyndham weaponries, they're a little bit shallower, and you can definitely tell they're laser cut. Okay, I've talked about this in other videos, but one of my pet peeves is this bolt catch release area where these bosses are. A lot of manufacturers won't get these symmetrical. There'll be one side that's wider and the other side that's narrower. And on this old Colt, they're pretty uniform. They look pretty good. And then on Harrington and Richardson, very uniform. They look pretty good too. Now on the bolt catch lever here, you won't see any parting lines. And if there was, they took the time to buff it down. If you look at the Fulton Armory, you'll see this parting line here. Now, does that mean it's a MIM part? I don't know. I think it's just a casting mark. But Colt's much cleaner on that. Okay, so on the right side Colt, you'll see some differences back here again on how Colt either finished all this off or the type of casting. You'll see that there's no tick mark on the selector, and there's no markings on the right side for safe fire. Whereas on Harrington and Richardson, you can see that this area here is a little bit different in the markings. Okay, as far as the Harrington and Richardson and the pistol grip that I believe came from Fulton Armory also, you can see that it's a pretty good fit as far as any kind of overhang. And the Colt looks pretty good too. That's an original lower sear block trigger group that is different than a standard mil-spec. Standard mil-spec trigger will not work on a sear block lower. And it's a two-stage Geisley. And I went ahead and used the Geisley trigger pins, which are dimpled. And the old Colt trigger pins are not dimpled. Something else they did on the sear block lowers back then, these are oversized. These pins come in at about 0.167, 0.168. The pin holes are 0.170. Whereas on the non-sear block lower here, the newer Harrington and Richardson, These are standard mil-spec dimension at .154. All right, well, let's take a look at the mag button. That's Fulton Armory. You can see the edges are a little rougher finished. Maybe the grooves aren't quite as defined. Come over here and look at the Colt. And gotta say, the Colt to me looks better. Okay, so something else they did on the Colt back then for this 1990 Sear block lower was they did not machine for a captured pivot pin. So there's no hole in here, there's no spring, there's no anti-hydraulicing or drain hole. So none of this was machined out. So what I did to get rid of the screw that required a screwdriver was I put this K&S push pin in here. And these things are kind of hard to get in and out because you have to push the button this way, and then you're trying to push the whole pin out in the opposite direction. But it's better than having the screw there. And this one here has been machined for the captured pivot pin. So you got your spring and your detent and your drain or anti-hydraulicing hole. Okay, so this is the Colt buttstock, and you can see it's all nice and smooth. There's no indentations or imperfections. The buttstock plate fits pretty good. Not a whole lot of overhang. There's still a little bit, but not a whole lot. And here's what I got from Fulton Armory. You can see this line right here, and not only can you see it, but you can feel it. Like there's a change in elevation as you run your finger. But overall, the texture and everything else about it looks pretty good. The butt plate fitment is not quite as good back here where it meets up with the stock, but it's not too bad. Okay, so we showed this in the last video, but we'll show it again. This is the Colt, and this is a metal door. It's not plastic. And if you look at the little spring-loaded latch here, you'll see a difference in the Colt versus the Fulton Armory. You can see that the latch design is different. This is also metal. Fulton Armory is one of the few retailers that still offers a metal version, but you can kind of see they're not the same. Fulton Armory fitment isn't quite as good as the Colt. Colt's not perfect either, but it's a lot better. But they're both metal trap doors. Okay, so other than you Colt experts, I think if you're standing 6 feet away and you're looking at both of these rifles, it's going to be kind of hard to identify the imposter. But like I said, on the 1990s version, even from a distance, you can tell because no bayonet lug. You might be able to spot that this is not coated versus the imposter. And then the other giveaway on this clone build is what we were just talking about, is this kind of seam looking thing on the buttstock where the Colt's nice and smooth. So anyway, I think as far as the clone build goes, I think mission accomplished. All right, bonus clip. Some of you probably saw this in the background a few times. This is my old Wyndham Weaponry heavy barrel dissipator. And I put this together quite a few years ago. Kind of unfortunate that Wyndham had to close their doors. Maybe not the best rifles on the market, but they weren't bad at all. And they did offer some things on their site that other retailers did not offer, especially if you're going to go with more of a legacy style build. All right, well, Pete in North Las Vegas. Only one thing left to do with these two rifles, and that's get them out and see if I can shoot one better than the other. Over and out.